you're going to just pay more attention to your environmental obligations, because if you're in breach of those and you're threatening this severe level of harm, suddenly you're in a completely different territory, which is criminal law.
Welcome to The Regeneration Will Be Funded. This is a show about regenerative finance. We are exploring pathways to a life-affirming economy. It's my pleasure to bring you our first interview from New York Climate Week with Jojo Mehta. She is the executive director of Stop Ecocide International, one of my favorite organizations and projects that's happening in the space right now. We were here 1 year ago. We had a great conversation. You can check that one out. We went deep into kind of the definition and the implications of ecocide. Jojo, thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me on.
I don't want to bury the lead. I know we have some big news to share, but before that, just if someone's not familiar, what is ecocide?
Well, maybe we could start by just saying, imagine a world where nature is protected from the severest harms by law. That is the concept behind ecocide law, which is what our organization works on globally across many sectors, including diplomatic and political, to move forward laws to criminalize the worst harms to nature. In other words, making ecocide a crime. And ecocide means literally, etymologically, from the Greek and Latin, to kill one's home, which is, a good way of perhaps describing what's happening to our planet right now, our planetary home. And so, we've been working on this law for a number of years in terms of, driving the legislative conversation, and some very exciting developments have been happening.
Yeah, and so in our last conversation, you took us through the multi-year process and journey that has gone into giving a very precise legal definition and structure to this idea of ecocide, but then also the end goal, which was around the criminal court, the International Criminal Court. So, where are we at 1 year later, and what's the news?
Well, perhaps I should just start by saying the definition of ecocide is super concise. There are a few paragraphs, but the core of it fits on the back of a business card, which is a new one, and I'll explain that to you later.
Nice.
But it's simply, ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts.
Legal speak for killing our home.
Exactly. Whatever you do, it shouldn't create this amount of harm, is pretty much what that is saying. But that definition is also very important because it's one that emerged a few years ago from an independent panel that was convened by our foundation, top legal experts from around the world. But it's also the definition that has just been proposed at the International Criminal Court by 3 Pacific Island states, Vanuatu, Fiji, and Samoa, who have formally tabled an amendment and said, we believe ecocide should be included as a crime at the International Criminal Court. In other words, to sit alongside war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, crime of aggression. So this is a major, major step. And it's something that we've been helping to sort of drive forward, facilitate, encourage, brief around for many years. And it is the courage of these small island states that is really leading the field in terms of particularly the legal avenues to address climate and ecological breakdown. So last year, Vanuatu already led 130 plus countries in the UN General Assembly to request an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, which is the UN court, on the obligations of states with regard to climate change. What are they obliged to do, and what happens if they don't do that? This year, they have formally proposed a crime of ecocide at the International Criminal Court, which is also based in The Hague, and which deals with these worst crimes, or the crimes of most serious concern to the international community as a whole. And I think we are at a point now where nobody is going to deny or to argue with the fact that ecological destruction is of serious concern to the international community as a whole.
So it's not, job finished. But this has been the vision. This is what you've been working towards, and it's kind of a step that's precisely in the direction of what you've been trying to achieve. So congratulations. I know there's no time to really pat oneself on the back or take a victory lap, especially since the work is not done. But it must just great for the movement and the organization to have had this new accomplishment put forward.
It's amazing. It's really, I mean, actually, as the diplomats are now saying, now the real work begins. Effectively, what this is, this is a kind of a lever, if you like, to have all the member states of the International Criminal Court join that conversation. We have to realize that if we were, let's say we wanted one of the big economies to move forward with this, they would have to discuss it in 4 different ministries: environment, foreign, justice, and potentially defense as well. And that could take months and years.
Right.
But these countries are at the sharp end of what is happening climate-wise and what is happening as a knock-on result of ecological destruction. And they have everything to gain and nothing to lose by putting this forward. But what is so brilliant is that what that means is it actually gives those larger states that are interested, but that potentially would have difficulties or time-consuming aspects in moving something like this forward, now have the ability to say, okay, well, we now have to join this conversation.
Yeah.
And so, there's a way that eases the beginnings of that engagement. And Vanuatu has been very clear in the way that they've put this forward as a conversation opener. What they are saying is, we're not trying to make anybody vote on this tomorrow.
Right.
What we're trying to do is make sure that this is recognized for the important conversation that it is globally. Recognize that bills of law, proposals of law on ecocide are being put forward in individual jurisdictions around the world. It recognizes that the European Union has actually just adopted an environmental crime directive that includes the possibility of dealing with conduct that they're calling comparable to ecocide, which is the first time that's been used in the EU. So it's an acknowledgement that this conversation is already in train, it's already moving, and actually it's right and good that sovereign states should be joining it.
Beautiful. Yeah, when I moved to New Zealand, part of our theory of change or hope or vision was maybe this country can help lead the way in terms of progressive environmental policies and kind of more cutting edge types of, setting an example and a tone for what's possible, because it's a small country. You can get things done faster. It's more nimble, more cohesive in some ways. It's not proving to be the case right now, but I'm glad to know that there's other Pacific Island countries that are leading the way.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned New Zealand, because New Zealand is one of the countries that has spoken out at the International Criminal Court in support of this conversation, saying, this is an important conversation to be having.
Right. Yeah. If someone was skeptical about these countries are just small and they face rising sea levels, it makes sense that maybe they'll be concerned about it, but it's not realistic for the rest of the world. I mean, what would you respond to that skepticism?
I think it's an interesting. Realism is an interesting word, because the reality that we live in is the reality that has been created by the intentions and actions of the people that came before us. There is no greater power on this planet aside of Mother Earth, which is obviously, if it hasn't grown out of the earth or is walking on the earth because it's part of nature, as indeed we are, then it's actually come out of the minds of humans. Reality is what we create. So it's not about, is it realistic? What is realistic is what we create to be the reality in the future. It's not possible to create a different reality by continuing to assume that the current one is just the only one that's possible. So, 5 years ago, nobody thought in a million years that we would get to this point.
Right. Okay, so the concept of ecocide is starting to actually make its way into the legal bodies of the world, but where are we at in terms of kind of mainstream understanding of the term and support?
This is an interesting one, because it turns out that something we thought we were perhaps failing at was actually something that's really been working without us even really knowing that that's the case. So to explain, we've focused very much on cross-feeding information around ecocide and, across many different sectors, but it's mostly been at fairly high level. The kinds of people you will find at UN conferences who are interacting directly with policy, and I would include climate activists in this as well. So there's also a grassroots element to that. But what's happened is that the discussion at legislative level has moved forward very fast, but the awareness of Joe Public, if you like, of the ordinary people around this issue is very low still. So, we, in a sense, had thought that we might need to engage, longer term in a, sort of big, more publicly facing information campaign.
Mm-hmm.
However, what we've recently found out tells us that may not be as necessary as we thought. And that is because we've had some results come in from a big Ipsos survey that was commissioned by the Global Commons Alliance. It was called the Global Commons Survey. And some of those results came out literally a few days before this amendment was proposed by these specific countries. And it was a survey across the G20 countries, I think all of the G20 countries except Russia, but with a couple of additions. So there were, I think, 22, 23 countries in the survey. And there was a question or I should say a statement, because you're probably familiar with the way these work. They give you a statement and you have to agree or maybe agree or disagree, etc. Now, this statement, without using the word ecocide, pretty much was asking the question, do you believe ecocide should be a crime? It was something along the lines of, it should be a criminal offense for big business leaders or senior government officials to approve or permit actions they know are going to lead to severe and long-term harm, something like that. And the response was overwhelmingly positive. It was amazing. I mean, it was just under 3/4 of respondents fully agreed with this.
Right.
And what that says to us is that there is a level of public appetite for this, which we perhaps didn't realize how extensive, it was. And at the same time, it also recognized, and there were other also questions in the survey that sort of flagged this up in terms of who people feel are responsible for the current situation and who should be doing something about it. And, government and business came up as really high in that. So there is this awareness, I think, a general public awareness that, it is those decisions that are made at the highest levels of government and industry that have the biggest society-wide implications that are the ones that need to be considered much more carefully going into the future and different actions taken. Because there's been such an emphasis, particularly coming from, perhaps those to whom it might be advantageous for it to come from, this sense that, we are each individually responsible for the climate crisis, for ecological breakdown, and so on. Now, of course, we completely support everybody voting with their wallets, doing what they can, using consumer power. It's not that is not powerful, that is powerful. However, the vast majority of the world, even in the first world, in developed countries, people can't afford to do that. They just don't have that it actually costs quite a lot to make ecological choices. Right. And that is because the decisions that have led to the options that we have are made at the highest levels. And those are things that, we don't necessarily have an influence over unless we put in place the legal parameters to ensure that. And that is precisely where ecocide law comes in.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. It feels so obvious when you frame it as like, okay, well, we don't want this harm done to our planet and everyone can get behind it. And yeah, we get so caught up in the narrative debates around, is climate change anthropocentric, and what, are these models correct, and well, what does 3 degrees versus 2 degrees, and it's like it almost like feeds this ability for there to be paralysis, rather than like, no, actually we're all on the same page. This should be illegal. And yeah, I really think it's so interesting. You're going straight to the belly of the beast at the highest international criminal courts and saying, okay, once we do this, then we create this ripple effect across our legal system to create this baseline of safety that we all understand and know that these types of widespread damaging acts can't be done. And that affects every boardroom, every government table, every treaty, every, local jurisdiction law. But it's not that like debatable or arguable. It's like, yeah, exactly. Of course.
It's kind of the most straightforward thing on the planet in a way. Right. It's like, you know what? Don't trash the planet. End of story.
Yeah, exactly.
And I love the way you brought up safety because, for us, this is fundamentally what this is about. This is about creating safety for ourselves, for our children, but for the living world upon which we completely depend. Because at the moment, it almost doesn't matter what else you do. If you haven't prohibited severe harms, then, by default, those things are going to continue.
Right.
It's actually really important to give those key decision makers the parameters that they need to be able to say to their supporters, to their shareholders, for example, we actually can't do things that way anymore. We have to look at new ways of doing things.
Because if I don't, excuse my interruption, then my competitor will. Yeah, and then we have the race to a bottom.
Exactly.
So it's like, yes, you're always relying on some sort of moralistic premise on top of, a competition free market paradigm.
Exactly.
And what's better is to say, no, here's rules of the road. We don't do widespread destruction of Mother Earth, period.
Yeah, exactly. It's a kind of playing field leveler because at the moment, I mean, it's actually virtually impossible for sustainability leaders in business to be market leaders as well.
Right.
Because effectively, there's always, there are always those who just care less and will undercut or have fewer scruples, or they'll externalize the costs. And also, I think one of the things, and I kind of come back to the definition here a little bit, because, this relates to the criminal law aspect. There are plenty of environmental laws around the world. And if they were all followed, we'd probably be in a much better place. But there's no real moral stigma attached to breaching a regulation. And also those regulations, and most of it is in the form of regulations, are very kind of prescriptive and detailed, often pages and pages of what exactly you can and can't do and how much of a certain toxin you can or can't use. And the temptation then for, the legal counsels and the risk managers in these big companies is to game that system and is to say, well, we're not actually doing that. We're doing something a bit different. And so we don't fall into that category. Or, we're sort of just on the edge of that, that red line and we'll be all right. Or worst case scenario, which does happen, of course, this is how much we might have to pay out in compensation and this is how much profit we're going to make.
Right.
Now, the difference between that scenario and the one that we have with a definition like this, which is based on consequences or likely consequences, is actually quite profound. Because it doesn't matter what you're doing, it's how much harm it's going to create that is the issue.
It's the results that matter.
Exactly. Yeah. In the same, and this is very familiar in the criminal law sphere. I mean, murder or manslaughter are not based on the method by which you kill somebody. They're based on the fact they end up dead.
Right.
And that's really simple.
So you're saying instead of a law that says you can only use 100 parts per million of this particular toxin in the riverway, and then the corporation goes, okay, well, we'll use 99 and we'll use this other thing that's not exactly that toxin and and they skirt around environmental regulations or have an incentive to, on the basis of those types of definitions. You're saying Ecocide really says, no, if you kill all the fish in the river, that's ecocide.
Exactly. And that's not to say that it's not important to have the regulation, because, I spoke recently with someone from the US Environmental Prosecution Service who said that actually the shift towards that kind of regulation was quite important, because when it was a cumulative thing of how bad is it getting in the river, then people were not paying attention, whereas when they were told you can't do X, Y, Z, they paid more attention.
Right.
But what we're now, the situation that we're now seeing is that damage has, the sort of levels of damage that we're seeing around the world are such that kind of outer parameter needs setting. And that creates a kind of a foundation whereby all the other regulations are going to be better followed.
Right.
Because if you're going to, you're going to just pay more attention to your environmental obligations, because if you're in breach of those and you're threatening this severe level of harm, suddenly you're in a completely different territory, which is criminal law.
Yep.
And that's really important, because that pertains to individuals, pertains to individual responsibility. So you're actually creating a double level of deterrence. Not only, for example, as a C-suite executive of a big transnational corporation, for example, I could be looking at a risk to my personal reputation, even my personal freedom. But of course, that is directly tied in as well with my company's reputation and my company's stock value. And we only need to look at, the Enron case when the fraud was discovered, and you saw the stocks tanking. This is what can happen. So there's a way in which there's a deterrence level with this that you perhaps wouldn't find with some of the other international crimes. Genocide or war crimes tend to be ideologically motivated. Whereas with Ecocide, we're not talking about deliberate destruction. I actually want to make this clear, because, this is not about pointing fingers and saying you're guilty and making judgments. It's actually about saying it is a safety parameter for all of us. And it's something that we need to be considering before we're taking decisions. This is about, it's about deterrence. But it's also about that acknowledgement that people don't deliberately set out to destroy the environment on the whole. They set out to make a profit in whatever field that they're working in. It tends to be a side effect of an economic activity.
Exactly.
So we're talking about recklessness rather than malice on the whole.
Got it. Yeah, it's just such a foundational piece that seems to have been missing this whole time. We'll look back at it and say it was obvious in hindsight. Why didn't we do this before? Thank you for being the messenger and the vessel of pushing this forward. I have a few other questions, and and I know we don't have a ton of time, but we're hearing a bit about this Pact for the Future, and I know this is adjacent to your work. Can you share more about what's happening there?
Yeah, well, in New York in the last few days, there's been a big UN summit taking place, the Summit of the Future, which was something that was called by the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, in order to, I guess, bring some kind of a reset feeling to the UN work and multilateralism going forwards. And there was a Pact for the Future was the document that was to emerge from that. It was actually, there was some quite controversial goings on at the beginning of the summit where it was thought for briefly that the Pact might not be able to be agreed, but it was in fact agreed to move forward. And parallel with it ranges through a whole bunch of very worthy things that we should be doing going forward. I mean, I'm not going to go into deep detail about how effective or not that may be, but it's good that it's been agreed. At the same time, there's in parallel, which is often the case with these UN summits, there is a civil society input. In this case, it was called the People's Pact for the Future. And it was a document with several chapters that was submitted a few weeks ago, prior to the summit. And that involved a lot of civil society organizations and interest groups, communicating over, well over a year probably to bring civil society's demands to the table. And from our perspective, it was an interesting document because it included ecocide law in two different places. So under international peace and security, but also under looking at governance mechanisms globally. So it was very important, I think, that was acknowledged and included at that point. And I mean, it's interesting as well that this is something worth mentioning in the sense that, from our perspective, of course that should be included, but actually it was quite a lot of work, I think, to get it in there.
Right.
And I think what that reflects is that in the climate and the sort of climate space, if you like, and people obviously trying to bring biodiversity and nature into that conversation and make it one conversation, which of course it should be. But the legal pieces in that conversation are few and far between. It is not something that is often talked about. And I just noticed even with this Climate Week, looking at the categorizations of types of events, there's nothing under law. There's lots of things under finance, there's lots of things under different kinds of aspects of nature or aspects of the problem. But there didn't seem to be any kind of section on law. I mean, sometimes you find one, but it's unusual. And I think another aspect of that is that when people are looking at climate solutions, we see a lot of impact investing. We see a lot of looking at how can the for-profit world help, and that's absolutely fundamental and important. But at the same time, it can leave organizations like ours who are incredibly efficient with our funds, with difficulty in actually accessing the philanthropic capital that is needed to do this. I mean, we're not selling a product. We're not a for-profit. That's the whole point.
Right.
And yet we need a fraction of what might be needed for some of these. Admittedly, some of them are phenomenal startups. But yeah, so it's an interesting juxtaposition, and we often fall between stools because what we're doing is not saving a certain number of hedgehogs or reducing a number of gigatons of carbon, within a certain time frame.
Yeah.
What we're doing is working at the legislative level to move legislation forward. And that has an incredible impact. I mean, a truly international, but also cultural impact. And yet it's difficult to fit into the kinds of categories that people are keen to fund.
Yeah. So, I mean, given the news in Vanuatu, I mean, you must have had tons of foundations and donors throwing funds your way.
I really wish that were the case,
No.
and I really hope that it will be the case. I mean, effectively, we are already seeing an extraordinary acceleration of opportunities. We know exactly what we need to do next to scale up, to move the political conversation forward, to do the right kinds of research and the right kinds of communications to have this grow in the way that it needs to grow. We really do know what we're doing. And this is a moment to seize. This is not a moment to seize up for lack of the resources to move up to the next level. This is really a moment to be scaling up. So yeah, and our usual resources are kind of groaning a little bit under the accelerated work that's coming our way, which is super important.
Got it. So approximate scope of the organization at this stage?
Oh, you mean how big we are?
Yeah.
I was going to say scope in terms of impact.
Scope of the organization. Yeah. I mean, like, what's the organizational size?
So we have a paid team of around 25, but that's a full-time equivalent of quite a I mean, we only actually have, I think, half a dozen really truly full-time people.
I see.
In terms of, what they're paid. But of course, with this work, as often I think perhaps the case with, these incredibly kind of impactful initiatives, is there's a huge kind of person capital in the sense that, we have hundreds of volunteers. We have teams in many, many different countries. And so many of our core team work far more hours than we would ever ask them to do just because they want to, because they know how important it is.
Yeah. I have multiple friends who have been, somehow involved now in different aspects of the Stop Ecocide movement. And it's cool to see it catching on and finding its ripples in the networks.
Yeah.
And you just launched a new website, brand refresh. Can you share more about that?
Yeah, we did. And that's, we've got got a couple of things. So we've got a different look. So we realized, and we've actually had this coming at us from a number of directions over recent months, even really over the last year, is that what our work has kind of already shifted to quite a high level quite a while ago. And we do a lot of conversations at diplomatic level, political level, and, many kind of high level engagements. And of course, when we started, it was very much a kind of grassroots organization and a kind of, we started with a demand, stop ecocide and activating a law to protect the earth. Over time, that became kind of, if you like, driving the global conversation, which is one aspect. But, over the years, what we really need to recognize is that actually what we've been developing is this law. It's by no means exclusively us. We have a hugely connective and collaborative approach, but it's very, very laser focused on ecocide law. And it's brought us into contact with so many different sectors, whether that's the financial sector, the insurance sector, investment, government, so many different areas. And we realized that our look was a little bit out of sync with that. It was still very kind of confrontational, almost kind of, demonstration placard type thing. And actually what we're doing is far more sophisticated and subtle and positive than that. And that's not to say that aspect is not important. Those grassroots mobilizations absolutely cracked open the conversation that has led to everything that we're now seeing in New York Climate Week. I don't think there's any denying of that. But when we look historically at, these big moments in, human rights, civil rights, all of these things, there's always this kind of sequence where you have the disruptive grassroots movements, and what follows is legislative change. And that is the place that we're in. And we felt it's also really important for those coming to find us to not be alienated, to not be scared, but to realize that this is actually not just an inevitable, but a common sense and a something to be welcomed to move forward to provide the safety that we all need. So one way of putting it would be, instead of saying stop ecocide, what we're saying is let's stop ecocide. Together we can actually do this.
Great.
Yeah,
beautiful. It makes perfect sense. It's just feels like just a natural part of the maturation, the evolution, the scaling, bringing this into kind of a more integrated framework for everyone.
And a more positive one, I think, as well. I think it's actually, it's really important that people can feel something they can say yes to.
Totally.
And, when it comes down to it, this is about safety for all of us, including the people we might not agree with, including it's so tempting to point fingers. It's so tempting to make judgments. And we know from talking to people in the corporate world, a lot of people are really wanting this sort of thing to move forward because it actually gives them the positioning to say, no, we really need to change how we do things. And that's something that, there's no discrimination there. And I think there's also an aspect whereby when you approach something as a battle, you automatically create enemies. And this is not about a battle. For us, this is about common sense. This is about something, it's not even, this is going to sound crazy. It's not even about an emergency. There may be an emergency, but this is not about that. This is about something foundational that should always have been in place, that will always be in place. We're just at that point where it requires putting there.
Right. Okay, so if I'm listening to this and I'm compelled, motivated, maybe I don't have extra funds to contribute to the organization. You're talking about international criminal courts. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know how do I engage? How do I get involved and show my support?
Well, this is all about a huge conversation. We tend to encourage people to, whatever area you operate in, we identify maybe three main ones. So if you work with policy or your organization interacts with policy, bring the ecocide law, topic into your conversation. the second is public. I mean, if you put out reports, if you issue articles, if you run events, all of these things, include this concept of ecocide law, include a mention of how this legal direction of travel is being established. Bring it into the scope of what you do. And the third is private, and that could be private in terms of private sector, in terms of your own particular work sector, but it also could be your own personal networks, social networks, and so on. We all have networks of different kinds. Mm-hmm. So in all of those areas, bringing the conversation around ecocide law and recognizing severe, widespread, and long-term harm as ecocide, that term has a huge internal momentum. It really matters. Go to our website. We have a kind of menu of possible options of ways that you can engage, whether that's with your elected parliamentarians or whether that's in your own sector. But more than anything, this is a conversation, and politicians don't like to initiate conversations. They like to join ones that are already happening.
That makes perfect sense. And if we have any foundations, philanthropists, potential donors listening, how do they engage with your organization to kind of have a deeper conversation about support?
That would be amazing. We'd love you to get in touch. There are ways through the website that you can do that. So please, just reach out and we'll be delighted to have a conversation.
Great. Yeah. Well, I mean, in terms of, I've made a contribution in the past, and, you always wonder when you make a contribution or a donation, what is the impact going to be? And you just want it to do as well as you can. And some people think about through the lens of metrics, and other people might, it might be more of an emotional or intuitive, sense. Personally, like I also really look for like where there are teams and organizations that are executing well, and like coming back a year later and kind of going, okay, where are we at a year later at Climate Week? And you said you were trying to get this in the International Criminal Court. Here was the roadmap and the playbook and the strategy. And then like, boom, it's like amazing progress over the last year. So hats off to you. And just my support as well.
Thank you.
And I also want to just give a plug for the podcast you have. I mean, this is a big conversation. It requires a lot of unpacking, requires a lot of different voices, and your media channels have been pushing out great content, and I see that
Thank you.
So the amplification of the message, I think, is as one of my friends says, waves on a shore, lapping on a shore, and you're doing a great job of that as well.
Thank you so much for that acknowledgement. And I think that one of the things that's really unique to what we're doing is this combination of the connective and collaborative aspect and the laser focus on one very, very specific thing. Mm-hmm. And we believe that's been absolutely key to kind of, in a sense, threading our way through the layers of politics, the layers of different agendas, and simply staying as neutral as possible. I mean, with the geopolitical situation and as it is, there are so many temptations and possibilities to go off on tangents and comment on things. And we tend to keep everything very, very clean, very, very neutral, but very, very focused on this one particular thing. And that, I think, has really helped us and prevented us from snagging on so many other agendas. Yeah. And so that's also how we, on our amplification and our communications and tracking and recording and documenting the developments around ecocide law, it really is that specific. Yeah. It resonates as a great strategy. Thank you so much, Jojo. Have a wonderful Climate Week, and we'll look forward to hopefully seeing you next year. I hope so too. Yeah. So go check out stopecocide.earth for more information and to get engaged. This was our first conversation at New York Climate Week. We are going to do our best to be publishing them out as quickly as we can after the event. So stay tuned for more great discussions, and we're going to do our best to kind of pull on different threads that we're seeing throughout this week, especially as it relates to finance, technology, law, and some of the conversations that we hosted last year as well. And for more great conversations and to follow along, you can always go to maearth.com. Please like, share, subscribe, all of that, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.